lecture, we talked about persecution and martyrdom and focused on the transition from prejudices against Christians and really rumors about Christians to actual persecution and death. Why would Romans actually kill Christians? In this lecture, I want to begin to ask the next question, which is, why did it matter? So what did persecution and martyrdom do for Christianity? How did it impact Christianity? And how did it impact the way that Christians talked about persecution and martyrdom? So as we talked about last time, Christians were perceived as threats because they were different. Many of these early persecutions were sporadic and local. And even the early imperial persecutions were primarily local. However, we're going to talk about these in more detail as we go throughout the course. Eventually, there are some empire-wide persecutions. There are some attempts by emperors to persecute Christians across the empire. Two particular examples of this that are most relevant, well, the two primary examples in general, both are specifically relevant for us in Africa. One is the persecution by the emperors Decius and Valerian in the 250s. It begins around the year 250 and ends, Valerian's death is in 260, so it's ended by the time he dies. But throughout really the 250s, there is an attempt at a more empire-wide persecution which will directly affect the African church. This is the persecution of the time of the Bishop Cyprian. In the last lecture, I showed you some famous martyrs from the early church. And if you look back at the end of that list, these final four here, 3 bishops of Rome, 1 bishop of Carthage, all martyred during this period, during the persecution by Decius and Valerian in the 250s. The other empire-wide persecution, and really the almost effective of these persecutions, was the so-called Great Persecution by the Emperor Diocletian, which started in 303 and lasted until around the year 311. And it's hard to say exactly when this persecution ended because Diocletian ceases to be emperor and there's a battle for power which Constantine eventually wins, and there is an edict given to make Christianity at least not illegal. Is that when the persecution ends? It's hard to say exactly when it ends, and it doesn't seem to end at the same time in every place, but it certainly starts in 303, the so-called Great Persecution. And the Great Persecution is going to be very important for Africa as well, because in the aftermath of the Great Persecution, in the area around Carthage will come the Donatist controversy, the question about bishops who were subjected to persecution and torture during the Great Persecution. So Africa was touched deeply by both of these more methodical imperial persecutions. And we're going to look at these in more detail in the course. What I want to think about for a few minutes together, however, is how these persecutions and how these martyrdoms affected Christians themselves. And I want to suggest that persecution and martyrdom had 3 primary effects for Christians. Now we're talking about Christian responses. How did Christians understand these events, these experiences? How did they process them? How did persecution and martyrdom function for Christians? Not only in a negative way, but also in a constructive way. And I want to suggest that out of these experiences and out of many of the texts that were produced, the stories that were produced about these martyrdoms, we see 3 primary effects within Christianity. First of all, within Christianity, there is the creation of a new elite class of Christians. While Paul might talk about the priesthood of all believers and would call all believers saints or holy people, within Christianity, early Christianity, practically speaking, all Christians may have been equal in God's eyes, but some Christians were more equal than others. Some Christians were better. Those who had suffered for the faith, those who had died for the faith, were superior to other Christians. Now we may say, but theologically that doesn't seem to fit. But practically and socially, this is what was happening. So in Africa, for example, when someone had given into the pressure of persecution, where would they go to ask forgiveness? Well, we might think, do they go to the bishop to ask forgiveness? Do they go to a priest? Well, there were people in prison who had been put in prison because of the faith. Sometimes people said, I'm going to them because they're imprisoned for the faith. They're superior. They have the charismatic spiritual authority. And one of the debates in the African church is, do these people called confessors who had been imprisoned or even tortured for the faith, did they have the spiritual authority, or did the bishop have this authority as the bishop? Many people, common people, seem to have thought that these elite Christians, those who had been at least tortured or imprisoned for their faith, especially if they were to die for their faith, they seem to have some kind of special charismatic authority. This idea of an elite class of Christian carried on after death. If you think about what happens when you die. Now, many Christians today believe when you die, you immediately go into the presence of God, into paradise. But in early Christianity, we see indications that many people thought that the average Christian, when they died, they would go to just a waiting place, like a waiting room at the hospital, waiting for the final judgment. But the martyrs would go directly into the presence of God because they were an elite. They were a special class of Christian. So one of the responses to persecution is that certain Christians are elevated among others, or over others. Related to this is the creation of a particular sense of Christian identity tied to suffering. When we talked about Africa a few lectures ago, I talked about the importance of suffering to African Christianity and how that related to legitimacy. This is true not only in Africa, but throughout early Christianity. Those who suffered for the faith were the true Christians. So we see this in a positive way. We see the examples of Stephen and of Paul and of Peter. And one of the things that I've worked on is looking at the ways in which Christians would talk about martyrs as if they were following in the footsteps of Paul. So Christians were presented, like the martyrdom of Cyprian, for example, is presented in some ways to show that Cyprian died in a similar way to Paul. And Luke, in the end of Luke's gospel, shows that, and in the Acts, Luke shows that Paul goes through a series of events similar to Jesus. So there's a model here that true Christian identity is suffering. Christians follow the example of martyrs like Paul, who followed the example of Christ, and that's what it means to be a true Christian. So in the positive sense, a true Christian suffers. In the negative sense, how do you tell if someone is not a real Christian? They're not a real Christian if they are afraid to suffer. So the martyrdom of Polycarp, we've talked about before, in that text, at one point, a figure appears. And he runs forward for martyrdom. And it says he's from a region called Phrygia, which is a place in Western Asia Minor. And we're going to talk about who this figure probably was. He was probably a member of a group called the Montanists. And we're going to talk in a future lecture about who the Montanists were. So this is probably a Montanist Christian, a particular kind of Christian, who rushes forward to say, I want to be martyred. But when the moment of testing comes, he runs away. Because he's not a real Christian. Because he's a schismatic, or even some would consider the Montanist a heretic. So you have figures like this showing up in martyrdom accounts. This false Christian, false so-called Christian, runs from persecution. But the true Christian, Polycarp, stays and faces his death. So true Christianity is marked with suffering. In the Donatist controversy, this will come back again and again, with the charges that your martyrs are not true, or your martyrs are not true. whose martyrs are true. Whoever has the true martyrs, whoever has those who have truly suffered for the faith, they are the true Christians. They have that particular Christian identity. And third, persecution and martyrdom leads to a strong anti-Roman rhetoric in the martyrdom literature. In an earlier lecture, we talked about early Christian attitudes toward the Romans and how in the New Testament we see different ideas. We see, for example, one of the questions talked about this, Paul talking about praying for leaders, and Jesus saying, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. But we saw in Revelation, in a context of persecution, a much different view of the Romans. When you look at the martyr literature, the martyrdom accounts, the Roman officials always look bad. They always look like irresponsible, irreverent monsters. Now, in some cases, if we read them carefully, it appears that these Roman officials are confused. They don't understand why the Christians won't just offer the incense, because they don't care what they believe. They just want them to do what they have to do. It's like, just pay your taxes. I don't care if you believe in paying taxes or not, just pay your taxes. Well, that seems to be what the Roman officials want. Just do it. But eventually they kill these Christians time and time again. So the Romans are presented in a very negative way, consistently in the martyrdom literature. So it looks much more like Revelation than, say, Romans or even the gospel accounts. And in some ways we understand this, and it makes sense, but it certainly creates a difficult situation for Christianity if all the messages about the Roman officials are negative. And in particular, what happens when Constantine changes things? And all of a sudden, those Romans who were so evil are now at least allowing Christianity, or by the time of the Emperor Theodosius in the year 380, he makes Christianity the official religion of the empire. And so now you have several hundred years of literature about Christians where the martyrs are always being killed by evil Roman emperors. And now the Roman emperor is a Christian. And now what do you do? This creates a conflict or some confusion for some Christians when the Roman Empire becomes Christian. But in this early period, there's nothing good to say about Roman officials. Consistently anti-Roman rhetoric. There are no Romans who come along and say, let's take a reasonable course here. They're always presented in a negative way. So certainly persecution and martyrdom was a great challenge for Christians. It was very upsetting. It was very destabilizing. But Christians responded, as groups always do. When groups are persecuted, they always find some sense of meaning in the persecution. And they always turn that experience into some element of identity. They begin to identify themselves in a certain way. When I was at the monastery of St. Paul, I was talking with one of the monks, and I asked him about the wearing of black. So in a hot desert climate, why in the history did the monks choose black to wear? And he said, well, in the Middle Ages, there was a period when the leader who wanted to particularly focus on persecuting and humiliating monks made the monks wear black the Christian monks wear black to distinguish them from everyone else. And then eventually, when that period ended, the monks decided to keep wearing black, to continue the tradition of wearing black. So what initially was used as persecution and humiliation, they turned the meaning of it and accepted that and said, that's going to become part of our identity. In part so that we will never forget what happened to those who came before us. And we see that same dynamic here in these martyrdom accounts. They're told in certain ways over and over again so that we will never forget, these authors are saying, so that we will never forget what happened to those who came before us. And out of that, our identity as Christians is being formed. Jesus suffered. The apostles suffered. We should also suffer. And I say anti-Roman rhetoric, I probably should extend this because in Persia, there are martyrdom accounts. In the 4th century of the deaths of Christians there. And in these accounts, the Persian government shows up in a very negative way as well as the persecutor of Christians. So there are questions about the Christian response to this and how thinking about and processing martyrdoms and writing martyrdom accounts helped Christians form a sense of their identity as well? Are there questions about these elements? Before we leave this topic, considering the effects of persecution and martyrdom, I just want us to think about keeping these categories in mind as we begin to look at particular martyrdom accounts. So we'll be talking about the Skeleton martyrs. We'll be talking about Perpetua and Felicity. We'll be talking about some of the Donatist martyr stories. And you'll be reading some of these later in the course. And as we're looking at some of these texts, I want us to be aware of these things and try to keep these three categories in mind to see where we can pick out these elements in the courses. So in these texts. So where do we see a special class of Christian being created in these texts? Where do we see suffering and true identity being shown? And how do we see this strong anti-Roman rhetoric showing up in these texts? We'll see them consistently and in different configurations in some places, but we'll see these consistent throughout all these texts. And these different categories give much of the meaning to these martyrdom texts.